Welcome to SW's Information Station. I am your host, SW, and today we're going to go over the context that is surrounding the book Follow the Rabbit Proof Fence, which is a book by Nuji Garamara, who is also called Doris Pilkington, which I may be pronouncing wrong, but very, very good book, and I highly recommend it. But it is also used for my English 112 students. So that is why we're going over it today. All right, so the context around the book. So there are things that you should know about the book before reading it. And I've made up this list of the different parts we're going to go over today. The author's names, who she is in relationship to the characters of the book, what time period this book encompasses, where this takes place in the world, some glossary terms, and where you can find the glossary in the book. What the term stolen generations means. So that's something that's very interesting. Also, we're going to go over what was going on around that time period in other parts of the world. We're going to dive into the book for one page only. Mostly for the fact that my students should be reading this book in order to find a subject for their paper, so that they can use a quote for their paper. But we will be pulling a page from the book to kind of give you an idea of how this book reads and how much there actually is in this book. It's only 8 chapters long. Well, 9 if you count the where they are now chapter. There is some differences between the book and the movie, and we'll go over that a little bit, and why you shouldn't use websites to quote from the book, because a lot of the websites are not helpful. All right, so first off, the author's names. This author, like the culture of many different Native people, one of which is Molly from Denali, actually has 2 names. The one name, Nuji Garamara, is her Aboriginal name, and that's the one her parents gave her. Doris Pilkington is her government recognized name. Okay. And this is the name the book typically is found under, though most books put both names on the cover. For my personal class, I don't care which name you use, but just be aware that the author is one author who has 2 different names. Okay. All right. So, first off, you need to know that this is a true story. These events did happen. Okay. The author is actually the daughter of one of the main characters of the book, Molly Craig. She was born actually in chapter 5. So it's kind of hard to think of her as a main character, when you don't even meet her until chapter 5. And she has a part in it all the way up to chapter 9, including a section about where she is now. Molly's sister Daisy is Doris's aunt, Doris Pilkington's aunt. And she helped in telling the stories about their trek, and which Doris needed to write the book. So this time period this book encompasses, it not only focuses on the lives of Molly and Daisy, and their trek across quite a bit of Australia, but it actually starts with the common Aboriginal life before European settlers came to this particular part of Australia. Before this, there's a lot that happens in the book, and you can see the simpler life that the Aboriginals had, that was more in common with the land. It was very nice. Molly and Daisy have both passed away since the book was published, but chapter 9 does give a mini update of where they ended up after the main story ended. Um, so, where this takes place. So, we live in North America. Okay, at least the students I have currently usually live in North America. To say Australia is half a world away is very accurate in two sentences. Um, it's on the opposite side of the world, and it's in the southern hemisphere. So, uh, in theory, if we were talking about the northern hemisphere, North America's up here on the globe. You know, we would be probably looking at the East Coast right about here, Florida down here, and Maine. And you wouldn't see Mexico because it's too far around the corner of the globe. But if you were going not only around the world, if you dug through the world, they always claim you come out in China for some reason. Well, this is digging straight through the world, and you'll end up in Australia or thereabouts. So Australia is, if this was the equator, it is in the southern hemisphere. We are in the northern hemisphere. South America is in southern hemisphere. When you look at the stars, which is also a subject in the book, you see different constellations like the North Star Polaris than what people would use in the southern hemisphere. And so the constellations they have there would not show up here. We can't see them because of the curvature of the earth. So it's kind of interesting. Basically, what it means is when it's summer here, it's winter there, which is fun. And when it's noon here, it's midnight there. So, you know, it's completely opposite of what we would think. You know, their Christmases are having a barbecue, and their 4th of July type weather would be freezing cold. So it's kind of opposite from what anybody from this neck of the woods would even think about. But it is quite interesting how it affects the not only the world but also the stars as well, because they use something called the Southern Cross, which is on the Australian flag, and we use the North Pole star Polaris to guide sailing ships and things. So it's kind of interesting. Where this takes place, part 2. So this is a map of Australia. If you hear of Sydney and Melbourne, they're in this area toward the green sections. Perth is actually over here down in the kind of warm summer Mediterranean area. But these girls had to travel from the little crossroads place of Jigalong from the north part of this blue area all the way south to Perth, where the Moore River settlement was, and then walk back across deserts, because this is a very hot desert area. And in order to get back, they had to go across and find the rabbit proof fence. And that's how they got home. Spoilers. Anyway, it has a happy-ish, mostly, ending. But it does have a lot you can get mad about. Anyway, there is a lot of words in this book that are native Australian Aboriginal words. And the book actually has its own glossary in the back of the book. That's very helpful for most native words. But just keep in mind that this is also Australia. And though they do speak English, if you listen to people from England, which is British English. They talk a bit posh and they talk a bit differently than we would here in America. Um, because the British have a very different way of speaking. They use different words sometimes. Sometimes they use the same words, like a plaster in British English is actually a band aid. Uh, so, they do substitute some words. But the American English originally derived from the British English. Australian English also derives from British English, but they went a different direction for a lot of things. And so, like, we have the Okeechobee River, due to being mixed with the Native American population. Uh, the Australians have a few things like the um, Coolabong, and those are Aboriginal words that have mixed in with their English. So even though there is English, just be aware that it is Australian English, not American English. And some of the words may be spelled a little differently than you're used to. Um, but there is something called a dictionary that is very helpful in finding out what it means if you don't know. All right. And so, one of the terms that I really want to make sure people understand is what stolen generations means. And I found this. I'm We'll have a disclaimer about Wiki later. Um, so don't copy this. Find a decent source that is like, I don't know, World Book Encyclopedia or Britannica. No, what's it called? Encyclopedia Britannica. Those would be good ones. But to not plagiarize you, I used Wiki, and I will have a disclaimer later. But according to Wiki, and this is a nice introductory signal phrase for those of my students, according to Wiki, the stolen generations, also known as stolen children, were the children of Australian, Aboriginal, and Torres Strait Islander descent who were removed from their families by the Australian federal and state government agencies and church missions under the acts of their respective parliaments. The removals of those referred to as half caste children were conducted in the period between approximately 1905 and 1967. This is a long, long time. Although in some places, mixed race children were still being taken into the 1970s. There is actually, for my students, there is a video, and if you have access to it through your library, I highly recommend it, called The Stolen Generations, which talks about this time and has interviews with some of the children that were taken. And it is quite sad. What was going on around that time period in other parts of the world? Well, the British Empire, before this time, was having a huge problem with overpopulation. They were a very tiny island. Okay, so think Charles Dickens, who is a writer, has a story called Ebenezer Scrooge that they play almost every Christmas. Yeah, lots of people, that time of period. Okay, lots of people piled up on top of each other, kids running around the streets begging, stealing. Okay, they had a lot of problems with lots of people. So many of the judges would actually send convicts as part of their sentence to remote places in the world to work off their sentences, like the colonies that eventually became the United States and Australia. So during this time period, they thought, oh, well, we'll just send them over to these places and get rid of them and call it colonization. Well, other people from Europe during this time decided that getting out of town was probably a good idea. And the new lands that were opening up promised them to become their own landowner. Most of these people did not have access to even buy land, uh, and they still don't in many areas. So they thought, hey, I'd like to go somewhere else. So many of them moved to the colonies to get away from their current social standing and start a new life. It's a lot like when you go to college. You're trying to learn a skill or do something that will improve your current social standing. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but that's life. All right, so now we're going to dive into a page from the book. Notice the copyright information here, just to be on the safe side, since I am having to use this in a Twitch stream and then a YouTube video. I wanted to make sure that this is for educational purposes only. But here we have a chapter from the book. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but again, if you're looking for a little something and you've lost your book, that's a page from the book. All right, so I direct your attention to the phrases on the previous page. Now, those of you who are my students, you would oops, sorry, that didn't work. You would recognize this part of the quoted area as being the introductory signal phrase. I have put all the quoted area in between it and the in-text, and these in-text are in APA format, just so you know. All right, so the book states the colonists were advised to keep up their Englishness at all costs. This meant having picnics, fox hunts, and balls. Well, these things were high society rituals and events in British life. Yet, in the book, another introductory signal phrase, you can see my opinions wedged there between the in-text and the next introductory signal phrase. They delighted in dressing up for these occasions and being regarded as members of a social group which previously they had only observed and perhaps envied from afar. This is very similar, and again, this is after the in-text, so this is my opinion. This is very similar to when people win the lottery and start getting the big car and the nice house and nice clothes, and as we say, the swag. Eventually, that person starts acting completely different from what you knew before. That person just gets to the point you're like, no, that's not the person I knew before they got all this money. And these people were hitting the jackpot. They had land for the first time in their lives. They had positions in society that they never had before. So they were encouraged to do all these things. Not, it wasn't really their fault for keeping up their Englishness. It was encouraged. And they were willing to go along with it at that time because, hey, we're proud British subjects. And so that's what happened with the settlers. And that's why there is such a divide between the settlers of Australia and the native people. And as we see in the next section, this book talks about how the author's tribe, the which I know I can't pronounce this correctly, Noongar people, and indeed the entire Aboriginal population grew to realize what the arrival of the European settlers meant for them. It was the destruction of their traditional society and the dispossession of their lands. That's pretty bad. It was the destruction of their traditional society and the dispossession of their lands. In other words, their way of life was gone. They realized that with these people moving in, their way of life was gone. And that is a big part of this book. Not so much the book, it's been a huge problem in Australia that most people don't even know exists. And I hope this kind of brings awareness to you, because if we're talking about, like with our paper, usually we'll be taking a quote and then going off of that into other parts of the world that are having problems similar. And almost every native people around the world have experienced this, something like this, in some point in history. I could mention the African Zulu country, the countries in Africa that had different problems, the Native Americans. More recent times, we've had Serbian wars, we've had the Lost Boys of Sudan, and it can even be related to what's happening around the world with COVID. This is a lot going on here in this book. How does one group of people move into an area and take it over without displacing the other people? It can't be done in a common, orderly fashion. There is always going to be strife there. And when that strife happens, it's not a good thing. And that has happened in so many places. And I really love this book for the fact it's from the perspective of the Aborigines. There's too much written from the side of the winners. This one's not from the side of the winners. I wouldn't call them full out losers, but they lost a lot. They did lose their lands. They lost a lot. And this book just touches on a tiny bit of that. There was a lot more going on in Australia during that time, because Australia is a big country, and this was going over the whole country, not just Jigalong and the Moore River settlement. So anyway, as you can see from the previous quotes, there's a lot of information in this book to unpack. There are many topics within the book, within a mountain of subtopics you can focus on. Even reading a small portion of the book will open your eyes to the conditions of a world very far away, but also very similar to the world we find ourselves in. Learning from the past does help us realize and avoid the mistakes our ancestors made, so we can have a brighter future together. Some differences between the book and the movie, and why you shouldn't use websites to quote the book. Basically, first rule of citing, always cite what you're looking at. If you're using a website, cite that. If you're using a paper book, cite it as a printed book. If you found a PDF of the Rabbit Proof Fence book online, cite it as a book found online. You cite wherever you got the information from. However, there are many websites that claim to have Rabbit Proof Fence quotes, but they're actually quoting the movie, not the book. And I would say the most commonly cited ones, and I'd say the nicest quotes, really are found on the movie, and so that's the ones people gravitate to, not the ones that are found in both the book and the movie. There isn't a lot that's really word for word from the book to the movie. There is one telegram that is read out by a child in the movie, that is in the book. I can guarantee that's in there. Past that, it just gets complex. Um, Also, a lot of students watch the movie and they're, wanting to talk about Molly's spirit bird. It doesn't appear anywhere in the book. In the movie, they are taken by train to the Moore River settlement. In the book, they go by boat, and the guy teaches them how to get back. Not willingly, but how to use the stars to navigate. And it's kind of weird, the differences. However, the movie is quite dramatized and only covers parts of the events from chapter 5 through 9. However, if you have access to watch the movie, it is quite good. And I personally feel it's a good representation of what happened with the many Aboriginal children, I should say, taken that were taken during that time, that became the stolen generations. Some were a little more dramatized, dramatic, of seizures of children taken. Some of them were very calm. The ones in the book were calmer than what was in the movie. But, this happened. I mean, when you take the whole country of Australia between 1906, was it, and 1970, when they finally stopped doing this, it's mind-boggling how many children they did this to. It's crazy. And the film is a more visual. You get to see the area, you get to see what the people look like, that kind of thing. So the movie is quite good. There is also a film about stolen generations that I've linked in the course as well. But if you have access to a library database, I usually find it on Films on Demand, and it's called Stolen Generations, and it's about the Aboriginal children. It's very, very good. Now here I have my sources cited. We have the book, we have Wikipedia. Now, most teachers do not consider Wikipedia as a scholarly source, so don't use Wikipedia as a source in your academic papers. I used Wikipedia, so I wouldn't be using the same sources you might be using in your paper, basically. Okay, so find a scholarly encyclopedia or dictionary. Like I said, Encyclopedia Britannica is one that would have that information. Cisco, I believe, also has it through the library, but there's a lot of places you can find very good academic encyclopedias to define terms and figure out more about things other than Wikipedia. But this is kind of like a disclaimer for Wikipedia, so I use it. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for helping to broaden your mind about the Rabbit Proof Fence, because it is a very good book. It's a very interesting book, and I highly recommend it, which is why I use it in my class. So hopefully this has enlightened you and inspired you to actually read the book.